Start our next session. Please come. So please settle down. We will start in a minute. So may I request all of you, if you can bring tea, coffee to the table. In a minute we will start. I'm just getting people to adjust. We start the session on renewable energy and climate change. I am Shikhar Jain, Principal Counselor with the CII Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development. I shall be the moderator and will have the introduction to the panelists, and we set up some norms because the session is between now and the lunch, so we'll try to wrap up the session by 1:30, 13:30. So in this session, let me just set the context and the brief what we are going to discuss in this session. The complete program is under the Global Conference on Environmental Services for Sustainable Development. I think in the previous inaugural session also you have heard about it. The key thing over here is that the prime focus is on environmental services. And when we are saying environmental services, we are also talking into the global context, because there is a lot which is spoken about Make in India and India being a manufacturing hub and all. There is another dimension to India, is that India is a big service market also. And if you see the Indian economy GDP divide, more than 50 to 55% is from the services. And that also includes the very small component of environmental services as of now. And I think in the last session, Mr. Reddy gave a figure of around 25 billion US dollar market. And we are only tapping around $0.5 billion. So that's a huge market that we have on environmental services. Under environmental services, our focus for this session is on renewable energy and climate change. So we are talking of two things over here. One is on the renewable energy side, and then on the climate change services also. So accordingly, we have our esteemed panel with us, which I will just introduce to all of you. We have with us Mr. Leonard, who is Vice President for Climate Policy and Climate Goal Lead with WWF US. And I thank him for coming to this particular session to share his global views on the subject. And Mr. Leonard is the organization's strategic leader on WWF, work to fight climate change, leading a cross-cutting team with members embraced across all parts of WWF conservation program. Previously, he has served as the director of US climate change, leading WWF work to advance government action on climate and clean energy while building WWF's program on forest and climate change. He's a lawyer by training. He began his career as special counsel to the Secretary to the Interior, specializing in water, Native American, and endangered species in law. And I think he will add a lot of value from the global perspective and the US perspective, the work he has done in the climate change and the policy work, and is also a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, where he blogs about climate change, and I think there would be some blogs going on for this session also. Okay, so may I request all of you to please welcome him to this particular panel.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. John. And good, I guess it's good afternoon, everyone at this point. First of all, let me just say how grateful I am to be here with you all today, celebrating Earth Day, and being able to speak about the important environmental services that our climate provides, and some of the solutions that we're seeing around the world. You know, my talk is going to kind of pivot off of the signing of the Paris Agreement, which is happening just today in New York. And you know, when I think about, I was in Paris with WWF's team, and WWF, you know, you may think of us, of course, as a wildlife conservation organization, and we are. That is our history and our foundation. But climate change, because it is one of the great threats to biodiversity, and all of the things, the people and places where we work all around the world, we've been working on climate change for over 30 years. So it is really central to the work that we do, and I've been very pleased in the 10 years that I've worked at World Wildlife Fund to see us really grow in our the importance that we place on this work. I started at WWF just after, in 2008, just after returning from a couple of years abroad. And when I came to join WWF, it was the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference. And at that time, one of the great stories about climate change in the world was that the United States was the big problem. We had a president who did not take climate change seriously, and we had a history as a country of not cooperating well with the world on climate change. So I think there was some justification for considering the United States, you know, one of the big problems. Then we came into Copenhagen, and we had high expectations as a world community that we could reach an agreement on climate change. And when we didn't, one of the storylines, at least in the United States and other Western countries, was that China was the problem. That there was an agreement to be had, but China was unwilling to cooperate and help that agreement come to being. Then in the years after Copenhagen, as we set up for the Paris climate meeting, there was a storyline that developed beginning in Durban in 2011 when the road to Paris was set up. There was a storyline that emerged that India was the problem, that India was going to be the one that kept us from reaching a significant outcome ahead of or in Paris. So I think in some ways the most important element of the Paris outcome was putting aside, you know, a storyline that was really about who was to blame, and picking and choosing different people, you know, with some basis for developing the stories, but really, in the end, those stories were incomplete and in some cases quite misleading. So instead, you know, as we moved into Paris, and now as we move to signing the Paris Agreement, I think, you know, we're seeing a turning point in the way the world is both talking about the problem, but actually the way the world is coming together to solve the problem. What we saw, you know, in Paris was an agreement that set higher goals for the world on climate change that begin to align more with what the science is telling us is necessary to solve the problem, including moving our attention from simply a goal of limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees to doing all efforts that we can to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, at least on a long-term trajectory. Another thing that we saw which really helped to end the myth of blaming a single country was that nearly every country on Earth came to Paris with concrete plans for how it planned to address its own contributions to the problem, and no country was a greater example of that than India, which set goals that, quite frankly, shocked the world, and I think was an important part of creating the momentum that led us to success in Paris. I think, though, especially as a civil society organization trying to make sure that we are telling the truth about where we are and how far we need to go, the Paris Agreement was important because it recognized that there remains a very significant gap between where the collection of commitments, those 180 commitments, left us and those new global goals. And then lastly, I think one of the really significant aspects of the Paris Agreement was recognizing how important it is for the world to remember that climate change is here today already, and no matter how quickly and aggressively we tackle the problem, there are vulnerable communities, countries, people, and indeed ecosystems that are going to suffer impacts, and we need to be preparing for those, and we need to do everything we can to minimize those impacts and help communities prepare and to face the unavoidable damages that we are going to incur regardless of how quickly we move. Now, as important as the Paris Agreement was, it's important to recognize that this problem is getting worse around us. So we have momentum coming out of Paris, but we also have, coming out of 2015, the warmest year on record by a long shot. This is a reminder that the speed with which we have begun to address this problem coming into Paris needs to increase as we go forward. And I think even in the first few months of this year, what we've seen, which we often see in the climate situation, is we need to rewrite our graphs because the challenge continues to move at a pace that's even faster than we can keep up with. So this is 2016, which is the same graph you just saw with the new line of temperature trends so far this year. And of course, we know why we're facing this increased heat content in our atmosphere, and it's because we are increasing the carbon and other greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere to levels that we've never seen before. I think one of the important things, though, and one of the themes of my talk today is going to be the importance of leadership from the private sector. And one way in which the private sector is leading is beginning to understand and tell the story of climate change as not an environmental story, but as a risk story for all of the world. Now this is, as many of you may know, the World Economic Forum produces a global risks report every year. And in the report for 2016 just came out a couple of months ago, and in it, for the first time, climate change appears at the top of the list of top 10 global risks in terms of impact, and it's number 3 in terms of likelihood. But that only tells half the story, because when you look at the remaining list, you see the rest of the climate change story, whether it is water crisis, whether it is the immigration and movement of peoples, whether it is the threat to the undermining of natural resources. This is climate change also, and for that reason, the Global Risk Report tells an even deeper story about how climate change is one of the greatest threats that we're facing, not tomorrow, but today. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about what's happening in the United States. That's where I come from. That's where I'm an expert. You all are the experts about what's going on in India. I can tell you a little bit about what's going on in the United States, and we can talk maybe together during the panel about where there are lessons to be learned or more collaboration to be had. So when I was putting those slides together and looking at this picture of President Obama, I was wondering maybe this was taken from after he watched the latest presidential candidates debating each other in the United States. In fact, it is taken from the announcement that he made. I was in the audience that day when he announced the Climate Action Plan for the United States to implement its target that it announced in Copenhagen and enshrined in the Cancun agreements. And I think one of the reasons why the United States has moved from only thought of as a villain in the climate story to one of the countries that was very important to the momentum heading into Paris was because of the work that the United States has been able to do at home on this issue. So a couple of pieces of information about that transition in the United States. One part of the story is what's happening in the electricity sector in the United States in terms of the new capacity that's being added over these last couple of years. And what you can see from these graphs is the end of coal as in terms of a supply of energy that is a part of the future of the United States grid and the movement towards both natural gas, but especially in the last couple of years, you're seeing renewables responsible for adding over half and a growing, even from there, percentage of the new capacity in the United States, and coal adding none. I think, though, that's only part of the story, because what's, of course, most important is what is the full mix within the U.S. grid at this time, and where do we have to get to? So as you can see here, coal and natural gas remain by far the majority of the